Welcome, everyone. Um, I'm really happy to be able to deliver this presentation for the Black History Month. My name is Charles Barthold. I'm a senior lecturer in HRM and Organization Studies in DPO at the Open University. And so my research is around a number of issues linked to critical theory, critical management studies, and broadly speaking, questions of power relations in organizations. So today I'm going to talk about decolonizing the idea of culture in management studies, questions around curriculum. So essentially what I will try to do today is to provide some modest reflections based on my own experience as a teacher and a researcher. So here are the objectives. So yeah, so basically I will focus on a particular issue because of course it's this idea about colonization and decolonizing of disciplines and teaching is absolutely overwhelming, and there are many things to be said and many experts. So I thought it might make sense to talk specifically a particular thing that I have experience with, and this is the case with national culture. I have written basically a session on multicultural managing in the core module of the MBA, but I had to define and teach what culture is in an organizational context, but as well in general. And this I'll be able to explain more later, but I had to deal very explicitly with issues of stereotypes and how stereotypes are linked to power asymmetries in terms of different cultures, and as well issues of colonialism, because it was very clear to me that from the beginning many of those national cultural or stereotypes about culture are inherited from and were constructed by colonial discourse. Okay, so as you've guessed, I'm going to try to be as reflective as possible. And also, I'll try to bring as much as possible, or at least provide some reflections on a possible synergy between curriculum teaching, as I have been starting to do, but as well research, because I have been doing some research on issues around race and colonialism. It hasn't been published yet. I have done, and I'm still doing research on that. But I think nevertheless that it's really important to bring about the synergy in terms of teaching and research to be able to try to decolonize or deconstruct colonial discourse effectively. And to do that, I will in particular draw and provide examples on the existing literature on post-colonial organizational studies, which provides very valuable insights and material to be able to deconstruct mainstream ideas in management, which in many cases are linked to colonial discourse. One thing I will add before moving to my first point, which will be about reflexivity. So this is my, the narrative I will follow today, by the way. So first I will talk about reflexivity, then I will move to the case study, which will be mainly around national culture. And as you might be aware, national culture in the management context has been, the author that is used by everyone explicitly, or perhaps more worryingly, implicitly, is Hofstede, who has a very specific concept of national culture, which you will see is inherited from or uses quantitative psychology. So it will be mainly about that. Then I will talk about some examples of decolonizing and management research, and then I will stop with a few lessons. Okay, let me start with reflexivity first. So here, obviously, many of you might be familiar with this Magritte's painting. So essentially, it says what this object is. It says that it's not the object essentially. So it's a way to invite us to be critical about language and representations and discourse. I suppose. So yeah, so here I quote Anne Conlife, who's a well-known academic in critical management studies and who is famous for um, having developed the concept of reflexivity. And I really think that this is what I will try to do today. So that reflexivity is important in terms of colonial discourse or trying to decolonize our disciplines, including management, because it's really about trying to think about what we do and having kind of internal dialogue with ourselves. And something that is really important is that it's not a positivistic approach. It comes from the idea that essentially research, like any social activity, is constructed by what we do and by the meanings we construct with other people as you know as we move on. I suppose it's not something that is out there and that we could measure as as an object independent of what we are doing. Yeah, something else that is linked to that is the fact that capturing a discourse or the effects of a discourse, like colonial discourse or stereotypes about culture, is something that is complex because it's reproduced in an interactional way, and I've seen that with interactions with students in a way, and how this idea of national culture as as something that is an essence essentially that doesn't move over time, and with hierarchies in terms of efficiency between cultures. I've seen how difficult it is to and complex to criticize it. Something very interesting as well is that it helps interrogate what representations are, and then as well think about the fact that fact and fiction can be sometimes intertwined, or that they belong to process of construction, and therefore it's pretty interesting when you think about decolonizing. So again, what does reflexivity bring? What I will try to do today, so try to think about, or at least be aware of, the question of power relations. Not only criticize what others do, which I will do, obviously, with the work of that, but as well try as much as possible to be critical about what I've done and what we do as researchers and as teachers, I suppose. I think reflexivity is probably a very relevant methodology to use, especially if we're talking from the global north, because obviously this colonial legacy is about creating hierarchies between the north and the south and reproducing them, I suppose. So when you are in the north, you are part of the system. So it's really important to be conscious of that, and reflexivity helps you do that, I suppose. So on the right-hand side, you can see a very famous history book from Dipesh Chakrabarty. So one of the most famous post-colonial historian. And it's an interesting book because he says, and I put it there because essentially he points out that social sciences, and all of them, and I understand management to be one of the social sciences. I mean, history, sociology, anthropology, geography, all of them were invented in the 19th century. And the 19th century, as you know, is, kind of the moment of colonialism. So in many cases, social sciences were complicit in the colonial projects. And as well, not only were complicit, but helped it from an intellectual perspective. So geography and anthropology are, with so geography and anthropology obviously infamously used, racism as a research tool, but as well history. If you think about this idea about developmentalism, the fact that the West would be more developed than the rest, quote unquote, this again is about reproducing the colonial heritage and colonial categories. So we have the same in management, and this is why I showed this book. Let me talk now about specifically, I suppose, my experience with teaching colonialism and this question of national culture. First of all, let me start with some context. So as I mentioned, this teaching was made in the context of an MBA core module, specifically in a session on multicultural managing. A few words about management. Culture, if you think about culture and management, historically, management started as a very positivistic discipline. So with obviously, Taylorism or the human relations movement, and a number of other literatures. So culture was not taken into account. It was neutralized in a way, in other words, Taylorism claimed that, everything that could be found or developed in the US context would be true in any other context. So this in a way amounts to neutralizing culture. It amounts to saying that culture is not an important variable. So you can do the same in the US as in the UK, as in Germany, as in Chile, as in India, and so on and so on. So Hofstede, this is why I suppose that Hofstede is so influential in management studies and especially with students. And it was interesting with MBA students, because MBA students, as you all know, are managers, and in many cases, and I could see how much they had integrated and naturalized Hofstede's idea about national culture. So Hofstede is extremely influential. His concept is hegemonic. It's unitarist, dehistoricized, and quantifiable. So what does it mean? Essentially, for him, it means that if you are Italian, you have an Italian culture. Italian culture is something that can be measured and that exists outside of history, outside of time, doesn't change in time. And if you're an Italian worker, you work in a Japanese company, you are going to essentially continue to behave along the lines of Italian culture. This is what it means. Which obviously is, I mean, I will explain what the teaching strategy I used to criticize that. But I can tell you from now that it's very obvious that, many people sociologists, anthropologists have criticized that scientifically, so to speak, in major journals. And of course, it doesn't make any sense, because it would amount, if just one variable would be time, for instance. It doesn't make sense to say that someone Italian now or would have exactly the same culture as someone Italian from the 17th century, for instance. It doesn't make any sense, just to take one basic example. Anyway, this comes from, there's a psychology background in terms of the methodology of Hofstede's concepts. How he did them. He worked with IBM in the 1970s. He was able to have access to IBM managers in their different subsidiaries around the globe, and he sent lots of questionnaires to those managers. And this was a very large scale quantitative project with thousands of questionnaires with people in different places of the world. So there was a kind of, I suppose, argument from authority, as there were lots of questionnaires. Somehow in the 1970s, it became something that could not be criticized, and which would become an element of of the common sense of management studies. As I said, it is unfortunately a very resilient concept. It's very difficult to deconstruct it. You can try hard, but it resists. Okay, so here I'll try to say more specifically how it works. So I said already that it's kind of fixist and essentialist and unitarist vision of culture, but it works through dimensions. So Hofstede claims that there are cultural dimensions. So he started with 4 dimensions. And then later he discussed about other ones in the 80s and 90s. But most of his work is based on the more robust, so to speak, part of his work. Used those four dimensions. So that those dimensions are in fact dichotomies. So first one would be uncertainty avoiding. So I quote, so some cultures would like to shun ambiguous situations. And obviously it would mean that they look for structure and try to move and want things that are predictable. Now I'm trying to explain what he thinks, and then obviously it doesn't mean that I agree with him. Obviously, I guess everyone has understood. Then there would be another dichotomy, which is individualism vs collectivism. So some cultures would prioritize the individual. Some other cultures would prioritize the collective and would then force individuals to conform to what the collectives want and collective values and so on. Power distance, some cultures would be, so I'm going to quote here, the extent to the power distance would be defined by I quote, the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a country, I repeat, within a country, expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. So some cultures would be egalitarian and some others would not be egalitarian at all, would like hierarchy. Last but not least, masculinity vs femininity. And again, I'm going to quote, because obviously I don't agree with that. So I quote, men in short are supposed to be assertive, competitive, and tough. Women are supposed to be more concerned with taking care of the home, of the children, and the people in general. End of quote. Okay, so as you've seen, so those four dimensions work with dichotomies. And he claims, and he would give a score to those dichotomies based on questionnaires, and then he would be able to place cultures in in kind of diagrams with scores. So again, so you would be able to say that some cultures are more uncertainty avoiding than others. Some cultures would be more individualistic than others. Some cultures would be more egalitarian than others, and some culture would be more masculinist or more feminine, masculine, he would say, I suppose, or more feminine than others. You can already see what the major problems are you have with that. Now I'm going to try to explain how what was my teaching strategy to try decolonize these concepts, which is very problematic, as you can see, and I'm going to move on and explain a bit more why now. So this is an interesting picture, by the way. This is a medieval Muslim map from the world, but it's of course not from the same perspective as as we usually have now, because it's upside down, so to speak, but it's not upside down. It just shows that now our way of seeing the world is Eurocentric, and that we put always Europe in the center on maps. But of course, it's not, and with the north in the top and the south at the bottom. But it could be, perhaps we are wrong, and there are other centers, and we could put the center in you could put the south in the top, and Africa in the center, for instance, as this map. So okay, so my strategy here. So first of all, I drew on existing research to criticize Ofsted. So very clearly, as you've seen with the four, as you've guessed, I suppose, with the four dimensions, we are reproducing colonial hierarchies, and Fougère and Moulet showed that in a paper in 2007. So if you go back, if you are, so clearly here you have a hierarchy, you can get it. If you are a national culture that favors collectivism, likes power distance, and favors uncertainty avoiding, what do you have here? Obviously, you have again, I quote, quote unquote, a kind of less developed country, less country culture, less inclined to accept democracy, innovation, and so on. So what you have behind those dimensions are a colonial hierarchy with the idea that in the West, you have individualistic cultures favoring democracy, favoring the market, favoring the rule of law, favoring entrepreneurialism, again, and you know, and so on, creativity, and of course, at the other end of the spectrum, you would have corruption, lack of development, lack of democracy, and so on and so on and so on. So what happens here with Hofstede is that, you know, with the kind of fiction of quantitative science, he is essentially reproducing cultural stereotypes and hierarchies, which are linked to 19th century colonial discourse around the idea that essentially, in essence, the West is better than the rest because it has those values linked to democracy and capitalism, and that therefore the West has, quote unquote, a civilizing mission in relation to the rest of the world. So yeah, so I used Fougère to show that it's colonial, literally. Then I used another paper from Moulet to show that it's masculinist as well. You know, obviously, the way, as you've seen from this quote here, again, women are supposed, I quote, women are supposed to be more concerned with taking care of the home, end of quote. This is a masculinist stereotype about what women should do and what men should do. This is extremely problematic and not scientific at all, for sure. And we know, I mean, I don't know, but historians have wrote about that masculinism is linked to colonial discourse, and that, for instance, in the 19th century, you know, colonial administrators or colonial civil servants would be only men, for instance, going in Algeria in the French case, or in India. So you would have very little, a very limited amount of white women going to those colonies, because you know the imperial colonial power would like only to show itself as a kind of masculinist through masculine bodies. I can say more in the Q&A about that if you want. It's quite interesting. Another aspect of the teaching strategy, I tried to use other social sciences to show that essentially what Hofstede was saying, you know, didn't make sense. So of course I used that in the material, and then students had to engage with it, to reflect about it, and so on. So this is what I call decentering. So first of all, I try to use social anthropology and have students reflect on the fact that culture is something that we construct together. So it's not something, as Hofstede has claimed, that is out there, a fixed essence that never changes, that, you know, French or Chinese people were exactly the same in the 17th century as in the 20th century. And that they are the same everywhere in every region, and so on and so on. But that's something that is constructed and that changes over time. And as well, so my point, I suppose, in terms of teaching strategy, is that there's a lot of material that can be drawn on. So, for instance, the claim that the individual is an invention of the West. This is something we know is not true, and we can use anthropology to do that. So there is anthropology work on South Asia and Japan in particular, who showed that there were autobiographies from the 16th or the 17th century in those areas. So it's just not true to say that. So we can say that. So I used as well Stuart Hall and cultural studies, and he mentioned this issue around power relations between cultures. So I try to have students think about that. I tried as well to use case studies, and based again on some research based in post-colonial organizational studies. So here are two examples I used in the teaching material to have students, think about it, and so on. So case studies can be useful because they make something that is very abstract, like discourse, something more concrete that students can relate to. So two examples here. So I'm going to talk about the second one as I want to keep time for the Q&A, but they're very similar. So the second one is very interesting. It shows that, and I showed this ad from the internet about MBAs doing an MBA in India. So essentially what you have in Indian business school is a reproduction of the US and UK model. So they would use, so first of all, academics would have to publish in UK and US journals because they are highly ranked and so on. But the Indian university system accepts US and UK rankings. So academics in India are evaluated on the same standards as UK and US academics, which means that the Indian system recognizes, so reproduces colonial discourse by recognizing the superiority of the West. And so those norms, so they accept kind of colonial norms by accepting that it's the Western center that sets the rules and that they have to follow them. And as well, they've done, so this paper was really interesting, and I had students think about that. It's not only that it's about norms and accepting them, then it's about the identity of Indian academics. So the colonial discourse permeates their identities, their subjectivity. Then they start thinking, if they have a colleague, for instance, and they think about the quality of the scholarship of the colleague, they don't think about it on their own terms. They think oh, this colleague has published in this US journal, so therefore he's a good academic, and so on. So it means that those colonial hierarchies as well become a part of their identity and their daily lives. Let me say a bit more about another teaching strategy I used, connection. So connection. So here we were on national culture and criticizing Hofstede. In that case, I connected to another area, which is the question of intersectionality and racialization of work and inequality regime. So the fact that intersectional workers, so female and, for instance, BAM workers, would have low skill and low paid jobs, for instance, in the hotel industry. So how did I do that? I first of all, I mentioned my own research. On West African precarious workers in Paris working in hotels. So this is a photograph, a picture of a hotel that was, there was a strike there with BAM, West African workers in there, female workers, and who demanded higher wages and better contracts. But as well, I asked students to search for information, and so another strategy might be to ask them to search for information and be active, and not only receive the teaching and information that we give them, so they can see that we're not, or that I was not talking about, I didn't invent it, and that's it's real. So I asked them to do specific search about the London hotel industry. So they could find some information about who works there, what are the like the employment relations there, what types of jobs do these people get, who are those people, and so on. And then I asked them to make a link with intersectionality as well. Before that, I had asked them to look for a definition of intersectionality based on some papers and so on. So basically, my overall point is that I wanted them to deploy reflexivity on what is going on in terms of colonialism and so on in relation to management and their organizations. The last point I asked them to do, and I think this was at the end of the kind of teaching scaffolding, so to speak. I asked them to look around in their own organization and check who does the cleaning, and and look at the cultures, at the ethnicity of who does the cleaning. And I hope, and I don't know, but I hope this was a way again to deconstruct through teaching cultural inequalities and so on linked to colonialism. I'm conscious of time. I would like to keep time for the Q&A. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show how we can create, or suggest how it's possible to create synergies between teaching and research in order to try as much as possible to decolonize the curriculum. So here's the photograph from Homi Bhabha. So Homi Bhabha has been his work on mimicry and colonialism, and how they participate to the construction of identities, has been used a lot in organizational studies. So there's a very good paper, just to give an example, by Buseba et al. In 2014 about call centers in India catering the UK market, and how there you have essentially, so that it's the abstract that I put at the bottom of the slide, just to show you a little bit about the complexity and the nice work that they've done. So what they show is that in those call centers, so you have Indian workers catering the UK market, and what happens is that they reproduce colonial hierarchies by trying to mimic the UK accent and so on, but as well because they get better wages working for a call center that caters the UK market. But as well, this was an interesting ethnography. So those workers were trying as well to in their everyday life to change their accent, their identity, and so on, because as well as it was a way for them to differentiate themselves from other workers who would have a different job, but as well because they faced racism and so on from the West, and the fact that the organization in the UK that would so they might face racism or with their clients, essentially the organization that would ask them to perform a particular call center task for them, but as well they might face racism more directly from customers they would talk with occasionally. So it creates a space for resisting as well colonial stereotypes and so on. So you would have this ambivalence. So it's a very, I would say, subtle understanding about identity and so on, about what is going on with those discourses that are very powerful. Self-orientalizing is another concept that might be interesting in terms of teaching. It shows how Asian, in that case, it's a paper from Liu in 2017. It shows how again you have, even for highly successful professionals in Australia who are of Asian origin, they still face colonial discourse and racism and so on. But as they have, they are professionals, so they're highly skilled and so on. They have some margin of maneuver to resist and try to in a way navigate that through playing and resisting those stereotypes. So, and finally, perhaps a third example that takes a more radical stance by showing how draws on this concept of coloniality, which comes from the Latin American decolonial term with Quijano, talks about coloniality of power. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. So in that case, Limke tries to show how you still have colonial division of labor now globally, and that you would have in the global south people who would perform particular types of labor that would be in outrageous situations of exploitation and so on, and that this would be this is a legacy of colonial history and so on. So you can think about obviously mining in different parts of the global south, including in Niger, for instance, or in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and or you can think about the ongoing existence of forced labor in a context or in contexts that are linked to supply chains of major multinationals and so on. So these are just examples to draw on in terms of teaching, I suppose. A few lessons, and then I'll stop. Provisional lessons and really modest. I'll start probably with my last point. My last 2 point, positionality. So, for instance, as you know, I talked about reflexivity. So I tried as much as possible to deconstruct the management study, the concept that we have in management studies in terms of culture, and show that it's linked to colonialism. But what is my positionality? I am myself, a white person in the global north. Am I really able to, if I follow kind of life, am I really able to, I have to criticize myself as well, and not only others, am I really able to entirely decolonize, deconstruct those discourses? It's really difficult. I don't know, to be honest. At least I tried in my teaching. But obviously, power relations continue, and they are very strong, and it's very difficult to change them entirely, but at least I started the process of being conscious about those and start a process of, I suppose, of making sense of what is going on. One point that Spivak makes, so Spivak is one of the most prominent post-colonial literary scholar. She wrote a famous, very famous paper, which is called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" And her point, it's a bit of a pessimistic point, but I thought it might give us food for thought. She says that basically she's very critical about social sciences, and because the problem with the social sciences is that again, it's a question of representation, and that the danger, of course, is to speak for the subaltern and speak for them and in lieu of them, and it's very difficult, because if we do that, then we reproduce colonial discourse. So she suggests, because she's a literary scholar, that the best way to decolonize is then to deconstruct a discourse and so on through linguistic methods and so on, which are linked to the humanities. So this is why my last point was, do we need the humanities to decolonize social sciences and management? Perhaps we need a little bit more of humanities methodologies. This is a point that Spivak mentioned. Yeah, and otherwise my overall point is, yeah, let's try to draw on interdisciplinarity as much as possible, and again, my last point is that I hope by explaining this particular case related to my teaching, I was able to show how possibly there might be a synergy between research, the curriculum, and teaching, and in terms of decolonizing. So in that case, some of my research, but mostly the existing very vibrant field of post-colonial organizational studies. And I mentioned a few papers from that perspective. So thank you so much. This was really great. So now I will just wait for Q&As. I think we have still a little bit of time. Thank you so much.